Vicha, thank you for your address. I know you have to leave us, but it was a very nice scene setter economically for Thailand, and it just gave us a little insight into your own corporation, and you spoke with great pride about what you're doing in the Asia-Pac area, in the Asian region. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for that contribution. Okay, this is the first session. Now the conference generally has as its theme, as we see there, trends in global communications. It talks about new tipping points, new digital policies, new strategies. And I like that cascading. And it feeds well into the session, to the title for the first session, Objectives and Priorities for Regulators. Objectives and Priorities for Regulators in Developing and Advanced Economies, adapting to digital transformation, adapting to new tipping points, and adapting to the pace of convergence. I'm blessed with having great panels this week. We had a battle of the panels yesterday, and I'm not going to go that far today, but we have from my left, your right, Shri Subta Gupta, who is Secretary of the Telecommunication Regulatory Authority of India. Now this man is seriously steeped in spectrum management and spectrum technologies. On my immediate left is Adriana Labadini Inzunza. How did I go? Yeah. Commissioner of the IFT, Federal Institute of Telecommunications in Mexico, and a great contributor to the IIC. Adriana is a lawyer with a background particularly in the defence of the rights of consumers and users of telecommunications in Mexico. And has worked as an associate partner in a major law firm specialising in the areas of corporate law, administrative law and telecommunications. On my right is Rabah Zedgi, thank you, member of the High Council, the High Authority of the Audiovisual Communication of Morocco. And I know you place great emphasis and interest in the audiovisual component of all of this. You are, in addition to that, a practicing university professor, and you are a specialist on issues related to business law and regulation and public governance. And on my far right, your far left, is Dr. Stephen Unger, who is the Chief Technology Officer and Group Director for Strategy, so it covers some territory international for and a board member, one I think of 3 executive board members of Ofcom. He's been with Ofcom since its inception, although he doesn't look that old, and has held a variety of senior roles and is steeped in physics and astrophysics. So it's a pretty good panel and a nice cross-section of geography and backgrounds. I just want to come back to the title of the session. I just want to sort of open the batting with some remarks just to set the scene, a scene which I've shared with the panellists and we've had discussions about it. In my mind, when you have three concepts in the one overarching question, namely, you mention regulators, you talk about what might be their objectives and priorities, and then you go on to talk about tipping points and adaptation to digital transformation and the pace of convergence, you know things are getting complicated. For me, it suggests that the traditional roles for and the responsibilities of regulators are in play, and that neither the legislature nor policymakers are providing sufficient intellectual leadership, regulatory frameworks, or the holisticness, the joined-up roadmap required in the face of unprecedented change. Just a personal view. So, my first question, whilst obviously a generalisation, is that a fair observation? Secondly, the reference to new tipping points suggests there's been a few tipping points already. Digital and immersive IP presence, step changes obviously in connectivity and other supportive technology advances, especially in storage and communication, computational power, the pervasiveness of social media. So here's my second question. What are the next tipping points? And are they just the compound effects of previous tipping points, or are they a gain of an entirely different dimension? And if they are of an entirely different dimension, have regulators adequately adapted to the last tipping points? Adaptation in terms of being fit for purpose, in terms of their thinking and capabilities, their agility and timeliness, in their organisational structuring, planning, and in their stakeholder engagement. And while we're in this realm of contemplation, what is the next tranche of digital disruptions that will require even more adaptation? So the third question, is it realistic that regulators can successfully carve out objectives and priorities within the traditional boundaries ascribed to them? Alternatively expressed, does the ever-increasing width of the digital ecosystem and one of its running mates, disintermediation, mean that a regulator must perforce extend the width of its cooperation net, cooperation with other regulators within its sovereign borders, with other regulators beyond? Now, these apprehensions of mine, if of any substance, underscore the reality that the historical principal reliance on top-down prescriptive regulatory approaches, whether ex-ante or ex-post, are dead, and even whether a move to co-reg and self-reg in the areas of increasing ambiguity and ageing policy responses will be sufficient, or whether the regulator's toolkit requires an entirely new philosophy and better tools. Tools like education and communication, greater cross-memberships of regulatory bodies within a nation state or across a greater extraterritorial compass, and initiatives generally, be they regional or international. And finally, adaptive or dynamic regulation, sandpits as we often hear, the fail-fast mentality. And in this far more fluid world of ever-quickening convergence, more agile regulators, more adaptive and dynamic regulation, how do you measure regulatory success in a meaningful, convincing, consistent way? Especially as accepted practice is now to move away from measuring inputs, or indeed just outputs, and move to outcomes. Now, that's really focusing on accountability. Are regulators really ready for that concept? And while all of that might sound emboldening to a regulator operating in splendid isolation, what do legislatures and policymakers and industry players themselves think about that? And in the context of the IIC's purpose of facilitating the interface of policymakers, regulators, academics, and industry participants and their advisors, what exactly does industry want from the regulator when this next tranche of tipping points of digital disruption comes to pass? Do they want certainty, reliability, flexibility, forbearance, broad support, facilitation? What do they want? So let me wrap it up by saying there have been some recent examples of dynamic or adaptive regulation that gives everybody some scope for encouragement. And there are some disruptive approaches that regulators, ironically, might apply to move to a higher order, to pluck it from this incessant, unproductive world of playing catch-up. Now, there's a lot of questions embedded in that, and I'm not answering them. But my panellists are going to ruminate across the landscape I've presented. On that note, I might turn to our first panellist, the Secretary of the Telecom Regulatory Authority of India, Sri Subhra Gupta. To you, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This has raised a number of issues and which are very complex in nature, and he wants answer from us, which is the most difficult part. Let me first start with thanking IIC for inviting me to share my thoughts with you. I'll first deal with the easiest part, and that is what are our short-term and long and medium-term objectives as far as my country is concerned. As some of you might know who have attended yesterday, last 2 days of conference, I spoke about poor internet connectivity as in my country. Though we have embarked upon a very ambitious program of connecting or providing digital literacy to 100% of the population in the next 3-4 years, but it is still in the operational stage. So the first objective or the priority of TRAI, the regulator, telecom regulator of the country, is how to fasten the rate of growth of broadband across the country. Along with that, we are also thinking of encouraging the proliferation of broadband through deployment of public Wi-Fi networks. We are looking into whether there are any regulatory issues that hamper the growth of public Wi-Fi and what measures are needed to encourage interoperability between cellular and Wi-Fi networks. The other issue which is haunting us, as I think most of the regulators across the world, is the issue of net neutrality. Net neutrality it's a small word, but it encompasses a number of complex issues. Last year, probably we were the first regulator in the world who have come out with a certain regulation on prohibition of discriminatory tariff for data services. And this was only with respect to one aspect, that is the tariffing, which is in the domain of the TSPs, telecom service providers. But we are also, as a policy of the government, we are also looking into the other issues which pertains to throttling, prioritization, blocking, and other issues. So we are in the process of holding further consultations with our stakeholders, and maybe in a coming year, we'll come out with a public policy on net neutrality. The third issue is readiness for IP networks, IP-based networks. In the recent past, one of the TSP in our country have built access networks which are pure VoLTE, voice over LTE. And the present regulatory framework which we have do not address certain issues, certain constants which have been come up with the VoLTE network. So that's the third issue on which we are looking at how to tweak or how to review our interconnection guidelines, regulations, which, as you know, is a lifeline of the mobile networks, to ensure that the new technologies like IP-based technologies, there are no regulatory hurdles. One of the other issues which also has certain a cross-regulatory which encompasses that is how to promote mobile banking and mobile payment system. Because again, we do not, in our country, a large part of the population do not have bank accounts. So recently, last 1 year, the government has come out with a scheme where each household has been now provided with a banking account, so that whatever subsidies are earlier given in cash are directly transferred to them. So that's another issue where we are working with our financial regulator and cooperating, both are cooperating and finding out how to promote the financial inclusion in the country. Another issue which is also in our priority list objective is, and which again I think that other regulators might also be having, is how to promote cloud computing and what are the regulatory hurdles. Because we are looking into issues which relate to privacy, which relate to security of cloud computing, jurisdictional issues when the servers are located outside the country, and those issues. So, and another issue is broadcasting related. It's not telecom, it's broadcasting related. We are trying to have a holistic view of the regulations issued in broadcasting sector since 2004. And because of digitization of TV cable sectors and the change scenarios, we are working out revised framework which would ensure equitable distribution of revenue to different stakeholders in the value chain. So these are our objectives and priorities in the short to medium terms. Coming to issue of how do we define regulatory success? Should it be defined at the access level or the network level, or how do you ensure that? Because IP convergence has meant a change in the regulatory outlook, even though the underlying principles of non-discriminatory and competition remains the same. However, the structure of the telecom network has undergone the change. Now the access is different from the network, or access is different from the services which are offered over the network. So how to define regulatory success? I think the first and foremost thing is to sensitize and educate our policy makers, our citizens, about the transition issues, especially the benefits and opportunities provided by IP convergence in terms of expanded network architecture and service development. In a converged communication ecosystem, innovations are frequent, rapid, and disruptive. In this context, I feel that the regulatory success would be measured by regulators' ability to deliver certainty and adaptability in the regulatory framework and reducing ad hocism and reactive regulations. Regulations that are principle-based, ensuring competition, innovation, open access, account for future innovation and regulatory adaptability, while ensuring that the cost of regulatory compliance are not prohibitive and do not have any adverse impact on the innovations. We have to facilitate access, especially from an emerging economic perspective. Regulatory success is in large measures benchmarked against the extent of access facilitated by regulatory interventions. And it is more true of a country like India, which is a developing country and is still not fully connected. We feel that as a regulator, we must facilitate the applications of new technologies, services that can extend the network to the unserved and underserved regions. But then, one cautionary note I would like to put in is, though access is a priority, this must not be at the expense of competition at the network level, as it would lead to undesirable social outcomes. Therefore, services that aim to connect the unconnected must be reviewed for the impact on competition also. In our country, we had a recent example of one of the company trying to provide free internet access to, in the name of educating the unconnected people. But we found that that was anti-competitive and it was against the principles of net neutrality, and we have to stop it. Though the purported reason was that I am trying to provide the connectivity, and that is also free of cost. So we have to guard against success at the network level, success at the access level at the expense of competition. So I would, lastly, because time is short and Chris has raised a number of points, some number of issues. So I'll only now talk about how do different regulatory bodies are cooperating, because it is a problem. I'm sure it's a problem in all other countries that different regulatory bodies think that they are probably better or supreme than the other bodies. So similarly in our country also, and with IP convergence coming in, with the telecom platform being the basic platform on which any of the other services by different agencies of the government rights, it is a problem. But people are trying to understand now that without telecom, they cannot provide the services which they want to provide to the citizens, and they are cooperating. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Secretary Gupta. In the interest of gender balance, we're going to move to Adriana.
Thank you, Chris. And again, thank you all, and thank you IIC for this wonderful program for this annual conference. And just as you look at the agenda for today and tomorrow, you can appreciate how the tipping points have changed. Yes, infrastructure and connectivity are key inputs, but there's much more. There's cybersecurity, and there's new forms of universal service, and there's trust and data protection and sustainable development goals, as we'll see in the next panel. And so just by looking to this and to Mr. Bishop's 6 pillars that we just saw in the case of Thailand, and that they're very similar in the rest of the world, we can appreciate how there are new issues, stakeholders, parts of the government that have a key role and that cannot afford to work in silos and yet expect to meet the digital economy and especially the information society goals by only working with certain tools. But as part of the governing board of the regulator, or the IFT, created only 3 years ago. I would like to start by saying that first we need to be realistic and humble as to what regulation and competition can accomplish and what it cannot accomplish. We, as a country, in the case of Mexico, have national goals, and on both the supply and the demand side. And it's important that we address both demand and supply side. And at the regulators level, mostly we address supply side issues and challenges, although we also focus on providing information to consumers as a key element to make competition work. Our main goal is to make sure that consumers have choices and that we can align private interests to the public interest. And we have a set of tools, and I think IFT, as the most modern agency created in this arena, is in a better position because it has a new legal framework, a new organizational chart, a handsome budget, than other ministries that have huge digital challenges in education, transportation, health, and yet are subject to the same legal frameworks and the old way of doing things. But regulation is not a sport. I think it should only be put in place, both economic and social regulation, when either there's a market failure, or when we need to remove entry barriers that cannot be accomplished because there's not enough competition, because there's an entity with substantial market power, or when, because of there's a need for social regulation because consumers and citizens' welfare requires certain rules to make sure they are safe, they are protected, but in a more modern way of protection. I would rather say of empowerment. But if that regulation does not provide net social benefits that are higher than its costs, then regulation would not be a useful tool if costs are higher than benefits. And I think at IFT we have been prudent enough to identify when regulation can provide those net social welfare and net social benefit greater than costs. We promote competition as much as we can. We have been successful to identify and remove some barriers to competition. Spectrum was one of them. It had made, for many years, artificially scarce, and that is a major problem that we have been very active in, putting more spectrum, both for broadcast and telecom and IMT in the market, when we believe that's the way to create social welfare. We have been able, by promoting competition, to have more affordable prices, and prices have dropped dramatically in only 2 years. But we have a challenge in fostering the deployment of next generation networks and deploying more fiber. And unfortunately, sometimes in this urgency to change the status quo in Mexico, well, Congress made a number of decisions and included in the legal framework actually regulatory tools that now are mandatory to us. You must put in place unbundling regulations. You must not allow the incumbent to provide TV services until a number of things happen. So it cannot use its infrastructure, its copper and fiber network, to provide a really converged services, while, of course, other players can. You must put all the 700 megahertz band to create a very disruptive and innovative open access wholesale band that will provide fourth generation and hopefully fifth mobile services, even in areas where competition has failed to serve the population. We have increased penetration of services, but still have a major challenge in reaching higher levels of penetration for mobile and fixed broadband. In some cases, mobile broadband, we have like a 53% penetration. Pay TV still growing a lot, but still like only 60%, and fixed broadband as well. We have coverage issues if we really want, as our Constitution offered, to make true this digital inclusion goals. And we have to make sure that we not only have hyper-connected urban areas, but also rural areas need to have access to data, high-speed data networks to precisely overcome poverty, lack of education, lack of basic health services. That's the way to leapfrog the promise of modern public services for all. Transportation, health, education, access to capital, etc. I think we must use the technology to leapfrog and to bridge not only the digital divide, but the divide between the poor and the persons that can afford services. We have also a challenge of licensing non-commercial services, community radio, community mobile networks, and be more inclusive and increase support diversity. And on the demand side, consumer information to consumer empowerment, that's mostly in the domain of another agency, a Federal Consumer Protection Agency, as is data protection. And so we identify a number of different ministries and agencies with whom, although we try to coordinate, I think we do need new tools. New tools to make sure that the state promise of a digital world and information society become true for all our more than 150 million Mexicans, and not just for half of the population that can afford it. And how do we do that? How do we address also new tipping points as questions of cyber security, cloud computing? Well, we also need to look at barriers, and not only in not in the regulation, but in our civil law systems. How are we going to deal with artificial intelligence, for instance, liabilities, torts? Who will be responsible for failures, for accidents in the automated world? What kind of skills and human capital we need? In the ICT world, more engineers, big data analysts, a number of new careers that I don't see we're fostering. I mean, many people is being unemployed because of automated procedures. So we need to create a new human capital that is really technologically sophisticated. And of course, the issues of secure networks and monetizing personal data as the new currency in the near future. And that in a way, yes, it gives consumers a number of choices with new platforms in the sharing economy, but it also obliges them to access to services by giving up their personal data, because that's the way to monetize for the disruptive companies. But we don't have a choice. I would like to see whether in the future the consumer will be able to choose whether to pay for services instead of giving up privacy. Domain names, IP addresses, cloud computing, open source software for smart cities, such as Fireware, all are new disruptive ways of working in the academia, in the civil society, in the private sector. And I think both regulators and ministries should also be using big data to make decisions, should also be analyzing preferences and patterns of consumers to make better decisions. Our other problem, regulation is good if you're ready to enforce it. If you don't have efficient and speedy legal procedures for enforcement, you are in trouble. And so how can a collection of big data or automated monitoring systems that can tell us whether someone is illegally using spectrum or a licensee is not using spectrum where it should be using it, how can we make an ally of technology as regulators, just as private sector is smartly using technology to understand better the market and its customers. And also I think we have to change procedures to make them more expedite. We're well positioned to try to regulate with the help of the industry. We have public consultations, but we are subject to due process. And so we see that a number of changes in our ecosystem, and mainly both demand side and legal ecosystem, should change to be more adaptable, flexible, and provide more answers and make sure that regulation is not in itself a barrier. And so I think we need to recognize that we need a closer coordination at the federal and state level. We have accomplished quite a few things with either deregulation or regulation and competition, but it's not enough. And I think we have to think as disruptively in the sharing economy and through this use of platforms as the private sector is doing. And we probably can have a further discussion on all these very complex questions to create this digital ecosystem with more than 6 pillars. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adriana. I must say I always have a soft spot for our Mexican colleagues. They have always been very ambitious in what they've wanted to do, and they showed over the years great courage, particularly when it came to the 700 megahertz and the digital dividend. And I must say that idea of enshrining these things in the Constitution, now there's a digital disrupting idea. We could all use that, including the regulators' funding being included in the Constitution. There you go. Raba, your turn.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm from Morocco, and I would like to share with you some of our experience, but this time from the content regulator point of view. I'm sure that we deal exactly with the same problems that Adriana said on the other side. We have another regulator who deals with those. While you were talking, I thought you were talking about Morocco. So we share pretty much a lot of
share lots
but I'm not,
of
yeah, okay. Then our main focus right now in Morocco regarding the regulation of content, since I represent HACA, the High Authority for Audiovisual Communication, is to enforce they recently implemented a legal framework. We just had two very, very important laws in last September. So you see we're still in the beginning of the process, and I am eager to learn from you and to hear a lot of your experiences in order to help us implement those new laws. These new laws, make it mandatory for us to revise, first of all, the private operators' specifications and make suggestions to government on public sector operators' specifications, knowing that the prerogative of drafting these specifications belongs to the government. We put the specifications for the private sector, but it's the government who puts it for the public sector, and we have to approve them. So it's quite difficult. The second thing that we are working right now on is how to strengthen the qualitative control of pluralism. Pluralism now in the new constitution that we had in 2011 is broadened. It's not only political pluralism, but it's also linguistic and cultural pluralism. We call that diversity also. So ever since its creation, HACA has strongly focused on promoting and enforcing political pluralism at the audiovisual operator level, both outside and during elections. This was made possible by the implementation of one of HACA's patented monitoring software. I talked about it yesterday or the day before, HMS, and also by the regulators' concerted decisions regulating political pluralism, both during and outside elections. The Constitution and the newly adopted laws have extended HACA's regulatory scope by broadening the definition, as I said, of this concept. And now we have to work and to emphasize on pluralism, or if you prefer diversity, language diversity, linguistic diversity, and also cultural pluralism. Since 2011, everybody knows maybe that Arabic is our national official language, but since the new constitution, we have another the official language, which is Amazigh, and all has to be done about this new language in the media. Another important challenge also is that both the Constitution and the new laws give a large place to civil society as stakeholder in setting and evaluating public policies. That's a very difficult question for us for implementation. We agree on the principle, but how to implement it, according to which criteria? Since Morocco knows a very, very active civil society, we have more 100,000 associations. So which ones to choose and how to do it? The newly implemented law gives citizens possibility to issue complaints directly to the regulator. How to effectively prepare the regulator to receive and process a flow of complaints that can potentially turn into an overwhelming task for us. So that's a challenge right now for the audiovisual regulator. On the second question, how to define regulatory success at the network and access level, I think that everybody will agree with the idea that in order to be successful, a regulatory strategy, both on access on audiovisual media and to network, should aim to fill the gap between what we call the info-rich and the info-poor, and also between the connected and the unconnected. I think that this topic was discussed yesterday, and it's a very important one. We all know that access to audiovisual media and to internet are key elements for social inclusion and knowledge spreading. They represent important levers to stimulate growth, and above all, they provide a real opportunity to foster human rights, such as freedom of expression. Access to audiovisual media can be understood, I think, at least in 4 ways: territorial media coverage and connectivity, access to information, pluralism, access for persons with special needs. What do we do in Morocco regarding these issues? Concerning the territorial media coverage and connectivity, one of the main missions of HACA is to make sure that audiovisual operators, private and public, comply with the legal regulatory requirements related to territorial or population media coverage. Public operators' qualifications established by the government, as I said, make it mandatory for public audiovisual operators to broadcast their programs free of charge for the benefit of all citizens. As for private sector operators, HACA, the regulator, requires in their specifications to cover at least 80% of the territory or population. Today, the private operators having networks allowing national coverage cover between 80 and 90% of the population. As far as connectivity is concerned, I gave some figures, I think yesterday or the day before, and I said that territorial coverage today reaches 99%. And I was looking to the figures of our keynote speakers concerning Thailand for penetration of internet and mobile, and Morocco also is doing pretty well. For mobile, for instance, we have 127%. Which exceeds the total. Yeah, people have two more. And it's very interesting because the smartphone part in that number is growing more and more, and that's the main access to internet. So connectivity is there. Now, what's the content that's in there? That's another question. That's the problem for the regulator. Yes, just to bridge the digital gap between connected and unconnected, Morocco has a program called PACT, Program for Generalization of Access to Means of Telecommunication. And this program aims to cover nearly 10,000 rural localities known now as white zones. So there's a big effort who is made to cover these small mountain localities and which are not covered. Concerning access to information, this is, as we all know, a fundamental right guaranteed by international conventions, but also by constitutions, and the Moroccan constitution does guarantee it also, which imposes to us regulator the duty to foresee that audiovisual operators comply with this very important principle. The new law related to audiovisual communication provides that one of public operator missions is to guarantee for all citizens an equal access to audiovisual media throughout the whole country. The new law related to HACA also entered into force, as I said, last September, adds a new prerogative to the regulator, allowing it to enforce compliance of audiovisual operators with the right to access to information. That also, we don't still know how to implement it concretely. So we're working on that, and we are also working on a new strategy to adapt our old strategy to all these new reforms. For pluralism, I talked about it already. Now for media plurality, I think that it's important for a country like Morocco. Our landscape, audiovisual landscape, as I said also yesterday, is quite modest. We still need to encourage and to have new TVs, new radios. We're doing pretty well on the radio side. We have at least 17 private radios now. And there's a lot of competition between these new media, and they contribute to enhance citizens' freedom citizens' freedom of speech through numerous interactive programs, and that's a real hype today in Morocco. Everybody talks, and it liberates the speech in my country. For access for persons with special needs, I think that there is still a lot to be done on this side because it's costly, as you all know, to have typical special technical solutions, and also to have experts in sign languages. So we are not doing very well on that side. For appropriate instruments of government to address policy issues such as competition, consumer, citizen, and citizen protection are at the core of regulation, regardless, I think, to the regulated space In addition, here again, to constitutional provisions, it's quite rare that the Constitution contains such topics. Our Constitution explicitly forbids the peddling of influence, privilege, abuse of dominant position, monopolies, and all other practices breaching free and loyal competition in business. And of course, you have other legal frameworks that also prosecute such practices: the Penal Code, the Law on Consumer Protection, Law on Freedom of Pricing and Competition, Corporate Law, the Code of Commerce, and some other ones. But if we specifically consider the audiovisual sector, we also find some dispositions in our law and in the law for audiovisual communication that forbids monopolistic situations and that to avoid also dominant positions. Another instrument of government includes the creation of the telecom regulator, who is responsible, as you all know, for regulating the telecommunication sector. And we also have a competition council, which is also an independent, constitutionalized institution created in 2008. And of course, its main mission is to fight against illicit competition practices and to regulate competition within markets. And that's a big scope picture, yeah, of what we do in Morocco, and thank you.
Thank you, Raba, and in particular, hold on. If we get a chance later, and given your strong interest in audiovisual and the cultural aspects you highlighted, you know, that interesting tension we have in so many jurisdictions and countries about the over-the-top players and the preservation of local culture and product and content. If we get a chance, we'll come back to that. Steve.
Thanks, Chris. So I was wondering how to even start answering the set of questions that Chris asked at the beginning. And I thought what I would do is I'd try and take the recurring theme of connectivity and think about it both from the perspective of a telecoms regulator and a media regulator. What are the issues that connectivity raises from those two different perspectives? You know, connectivity is at the heart of most of the debates that are going on at the moment. They're at the heart. So connectivity, that's better, isn't it? Connectivity is the heart of the strategic review that we carried out last year of the UK's communications sector. And connectivity is also at the heart of the latest proposals from the European Commission for a new European regulatory framework. And I say, I want to think about connectivity both from the perspective of a telecoms regulator and a media regulator. From the perspective of a telecoms regulator, it's all about hardware and software and apps and security. There's a bucket of questions, and I might just pick out 4 or so of them. Firstly, there is this very big question, what is the roadmap to gigabit speeds? How do we get from services which are currently delivering perhaps a few tens of megabits to gigabit bandwidth to every home in the country? That is essentially a big civil engineering challenge. It's about digging up copper that was laid across the country over 100 years ago and replacing it with fibre, and trying to work out how we can make that cost effective for our operators. That's a big question. That's a big transformational question. The second really big challenge for us is how to make sure that as we go through that process, we don't leave people behind. So we think we probably can deliver fibre connectivity to everyone in the big cities, places like London, Manchester, Edinburgh. But delivering fibre to every home in the Scottish Highlands is going to be more difficult. So we're doing a lot of work at the moment to develop a decent broadband universal service obligation, working closely with our government. An obligation that would start at a speed of around 10 megabits per second, which is something we would currently regard as a decent safety net, but also have a mechanism to allow that broadband USO to increase over time. So how to deliver fibre, but also not leave others behind. Those are the big fixed network issues. There's a set of questions in mobile which somewhat parallel the fixed network questions. Essentially, we spent about 15 years promising mobile users that they'd be able to use their mobile devices to consume video, and I don't think we've yet really got to that point. And I remember before the 3G auction, the promise of 3G was that it was going to allow streaming video to any device. You could sort of just about do it as long as you didn't have a data cap, and actually most people ended up hopping between Wi-Fi hotspots in order to actually consume video. So, you know, will the answer be 4G? Do we have to wait for 5G? And what is 5G? There's a set of questions there. And then there's the other big wireless debate, which is around the Internet of Things. What will it take to deliver new, again, transformational networks that support the Internet of Things? Interestingly, the debate there is less about some of the traditional issues that we've looked at as a spectrum regulator, access to spectrum. Much of the debate there seems to be about security and privacy. How can we deliver a sort of settlement on security and privacy which works for both industry and consumers? And then finally for us, there's a very big bucket of issues we're looking at the moment on the sort of telco side, which is around industry structure. So we spent most of last year worrying about mobile mergers, actually trying to stop a mobile merger, so we retain 4 operators in the market to have real infrastructure competition. The big debate that we're having in the UK at the moment on the fixed network side is about whether we should break up our incumbent operator, British Telecom. What would that mean for competition? What would it mean for investment and so on? So those are the sort of big questions of the moment as a telecoms regulator. As a media regulator, connectivity is the thing that drives change. It drives change in the way audiences access content. That is now very clear. We can see that particularly younger audiences are accessing content online. Some very interesting statistics we published a year or so ago in our regular review of public service broadcasting, which basically says younger people are viewing content online and they're not going to go back to watching the telly, even as they grow older. That is, again, quite transformational for media regulation, and I pick out 3 different ways in which that's the case. Firstly, you know, at the heart of our media regulation is a set of duties around audience protection, you know, stopping children accessing pornography at the most basic level, and a range of other measures, but that's probably the most basic one. There's a very clear set of challenges for any media regulator around how you take traditional controls on access to content, controls such as the watershed, a rule that says you can only put adult content on after a certain time in the evening. How does that work online? It just doesn't. So some challenges around online audience protection. Second big set of challenges around online is actually in relation to public service broadcasting. Next year we are going to take on the regulation of the BBC from around April. We will be responsible for both ensuring that the BBC delivers on its public policy objectives, but also ensuring that it doesn't too much distort the market in doing so. And that's a particular challenge online because it's really important that public service broadcasters are able to experiment online with new ways of reaching audiences. They need to be able to develop new services, but it is also very important in doing so they don't crowd out commercial services, they don't crowd out competitors. So that's another big tension between, if you like, the PSB side of things and the competition side of media regulation. And then finally, we already heard briefly, media plurality. You know, online, there's a really interesting set of questions around online media in the context of the never-ending debates around media plurality. You know, in the UK and in many other countries, we can see newspapers in steep decline. People basically don't read newspapers anymore, perhaps on their iPads, but certainly not paper. We can see this decline in TV viewing, and we can increasingly, therefore, see people accessing news, current affairs information over the internet. That could be a really good thing for plurality. It could mean that essentially audiences have access to an almost infinite supply of content, but there is a counter-argument that because of the control that some players have of the way people navigate the internet, there's a new type of problem. That there's a lot of content there, but how do you find it? So there's a really set of questions there, again, quite transformational around media plurality. I won't go into any other questions, because I wanted to pick out 2 overarching concerns, I suppose, I have at the moment. One is that there's often a very large gap between the aspirations that everyone rightly has for what the communication sector can deliver, both consumers and citizens, and the regulatory tools that are actually available to us. So just one example, mobile coverage is probably something which I get bugged about more than almost anything else. Probably the only thing I get bugged about more is nuisance calls, the subject of the workshop yesterday. We all agree that we have a vision which says that mobile ought to be ubiquitously available. There was a quite interesting report produced for the European Commission a couple of weeks ago suggesting that if only 5G was to deliver high bandwidth connectivity at every point in Europe, there would be a very large figure for economic gains. I can't remember the number, it doesn't actually matter. Because the real issue is how do you actually achieve that? How do you actually get that mobile connectivity everywhere? We don't have the regulatory levers to do that. And I think that takes me to this point that Chris made about the importance of new types of tools, new approaches to regulation. We need to recognise that there will be some times when we are regulating using like hard law. There are some times when we'll be in court trying to face down dodgy practices amongst our industry, and we need to be up for that type of engagement with our community, I'm afraid. But there'll be other times when it'll be really important we find ways of collaborating with our sector, trying to find innovative solutions to problems that are in the sector where we have a degree of common interest. And I think I'm particularly interested in how we can vary our dialogue with our stakeholders in that sort of way. And then finally, and very briefly, we have, as a country, a very particular set of challenges at the moment, which I thought I should note because others will ask the question, the Brexit question. Against that background where there's a great deal of uncertainty in the way the market is evolving, there's a great deal of uncertainty in any case around the investment cases for new infrastructure. Brexit is sort of added spice for us to that type of debate. I'm not going to comment on the politics of Brexit. I haven't a clue where we're going to end up. But it clearly frames, it provides context to a fair bit of what we're doing. Uncertainty is never a terribly good thing in regulation. I'll probably stop there.
Good, thank you. Thanks very much, Steve. As chair, I've done reasonably well in getting through the set pieces, and we've got about half an hour, which is a handsome amount of time for some